I should have known something was off the day I first met Daniel Carver. You don't spend 12 years grinding your way up in a corporate firm without learning to read people. And everything about him was a performance: the tailored suits, the toothpaste commercial smile, the way he looked past you when you spoke, scanning the room for someone more important. But I didn't see it then. I was too busy being grateful. Grateful to have made it. Grateful to be named senior project manager at Drayden Consulting, a firm that had once seemed so far above where I came from, a crumbling Midwestern town and a single mother who worked double shifts at the diner. I was 35, no kids, no marriage, just this career, my entire life in a gleaming glass tower on the 17th floor. And when Daniel replaced our previous VP of operations, I thought, finally, someone who sees my worth. A T first. It seemed true. He brought me in on high-profile accounts, gave me speaking time during client meetings, called me the linchpin of this team. Those words carried weight, more than I care to admit. I remember our first one-on-one review. He sat across from me in his corner office, the city lights shimmering behind him. "You're one of the sharpest minds here, Helena," he said, "but you play too small. You should be running this department." It was everything I wanted to hear. So when he started pulling me aside for coffee, inviting me to leadership dinners, I leaned in, eager, stupid. Looking back, it was textbook, a pattern I would only understand far too late. It began small, a joke here, a casual comment there. "You looked great in that dress yesterday. You should smile more in meetings, clients love it." I brushed it off, told myself not to be that woman. After all, he was promoting me, championing me. I was finally getting the recognition I deserved. Then came the Vegas conference, 3 days of client pitches, panels, late-night networking. The second evening, after too many drinks at a firm-sponsored dinner, he cornered me in the elevator. I can still smell the bourbon on his breath. "Come up to my suite," he murmured. "We'll strategize for tomorrow." I froze, politely declined. Firm but professional. His face shifted just for a second, that charming mask slipping to reveal something cold, calculating. But by morning, he was all smiles again. Pretended nothing had happened. I thought that was the end of it. I thought refusing him had drawn the line. God, I was naive. The retaliation started subtly. Projects reassigned. Clients I'd built relationships with handed to younger, more compliant team members. I'd walk into meetings to find decisions made without me. When I confronted him, he smiled. "You've seemed distracted lately, Helena. Maybe it's time you focused on smaller accounts until you're back on form." Back on form. I worked harder, stayed later, naively thinking I could outwork his sabotage. Then came the rumors, whispers that I was unstable, difficult to manage, that I'd slept my way into promotions. I traced them back, of course, quietly, patiently. Every road led to Daniel. HR was useless. The VP of HR was an old golfing buddy of his. The formal complaint I filed disappeared into a black hole. No follow-up, no investigation. I was drowning, and then, in the cruelest twist, they launched a department restructure. I was called into a glass-walled conference room, 2 HR reps waiting, legal papers on the table. "We regret to inform you your position is being eliminated. You'll receive a severance package, contingent upon signing a non-disparagement agreement." I stared at the papers. My hands didn't shake. My voice didn't waver. I asked one question. Did Daniel authorize this? Neither of them met my eyes. I left the building with a cardboard box and my dignity hanging by a thread. 12 years, gone. Worse than the job loss was the smear. Daniel made sure of that. My LinkedIn network dried up overnight. Emails went unanswered. Recruiters who'd courted me weeks prior suddenly weren't moving forward. Word had spread that I was a liability. Volatile. I spent weeks in that one-bedroom apartment, curtains drawn, watching the rain blur the skyline, but grief curdled into rage. Not petty anger, not office politics. The kind of rage that sits in your gut like molten steel, shaping itself into a blade. I wasn't going to move on. I was going to burn him to the ground, but I knew better than to strike recklessly. Daniel was too powerful, too insulated. His persona was pristine. I needed a plan, something airtight, permanent. First, I built a timeline. Every comment, every retaliation, every HR interaction, documented meticulously. Then I started reaching out, quietly, to other women who'd left the firm under vague circumstances. It wasn't hard. He'd been sloppy over the years. What I found made me sick. 6 women. 6 stories like mine, some worse. One had been cornered in a hotel room. Another blackballed from the industry after rejecting him. I compiled everything. Cross-referenced dates, emails, meeting records. A lattice of misconduct and retaliation. But it wasn't enough. He'd weathered HR complaints before. I needed leverage. That would stick. That's when I remembered Vanessa, a former executive assistant who'd left under a cloud after just 9 months. It took me weeks to find her. But when I did through an old LinkedIn group, she agreed to meet. We sat in a dingy cafe, her eyes wary. I know what he did, I said simply. I'm not here to dredge it up unless you want to, but I'm building something. If you're willing to help, we can make sure he never does this again. She stared at me for a long time, then pulled a battered flash drive from her purse. I kept everything, she whispered. Emails, calendars, recordings. I couldn't prove anything then, but maybe you can. I took it with shaking hands. I barely slept that night, poring through the files. It was gold. Dozens of emails that hinted somehow stated his pattern of grooming, coercion, retaliation. A trove of evidence. But the crown jewel was a recorded phone call, Daniel bragging to a colleague about breaking a junior manager who'd refused his advances. I wanted to vomit. But this would end him. Now I needed a delivery mechanism. Public HR cases could be buried. Lawsuits settled quietly. I wanted exposure. Scorched earth. Ender Roxon, an investigative journalist I'd befriended years ago during a charity event. I reached out, carefully, explained the situation, offered full transparency. It took one meeting for her to commit. Give me everything, she said. We'll corroborate, we'll vet, but if this checks out, it'll be front page. For 6 months, we worked in secret. Interviews, legal reviews, cross-referencing timelines. Meanwhile, I gathered more victims. More voices. By the time the story dropped, it wasn't just about me. It was about a pattern of abuse spanning 8 years, implicating not just Daniel but the complicit HR execs and leadership who'd shielded him. The morning it hit, I sat in that same cafe where Vanessa had handed me the flash drive, coffee untouched, watching as the news spread like wildfire. Drayton Consulting VP faces sexual misconduct allegations, retaliation claims. He read every word, saw the screenshots of his emails, the transcribed recordings. My phone buzzed incessantly, calls, texts, LinkedIn pings. But the best was the footage that surfaced 2 days later. Daniel, flanked by corporate lawyers, leaving the building in disgrace. His wife, a well-known philanthropist, filing for divorce that same week. By month's end, Drayton Consulting was bleeding clients. Their stock plummeted. A full board shakeup ensued. Daniel, last I heard, he fled the state, facing civil suits from 6 women. No job offers, no industry allies. I'd taken everything from him: his freedom, his family, his fortune. Some nights, I still lie awake, not from regret, from the sheer weight of it. But then I remember that elevator in Vegas, his voice in my ear, and I sleep like a stone. I underestimated how long revenge would linger in your veins after the moment it served. The public exposure of Daniel Carver should have been the climax. The article went viral in corporate circles. National outlets picked it up. Within a week, he was trending for all the wrong reasons on professional networks. Yet in the quiet aftermath, sitting alone in my apartment, I didn't feel triumphant. Not immediately. I felt raw, spent, hollowed out in places I hadn't known were carved. But clarity comes with time. I had destroyed him publicly. Now I would make sure there was no coming back. Because men like Daniel, they reinvent themselves. They find new firms, smaller ponds where their brand of rot can spread again. I wasn't going to allow that. I spent the following weeks methodically tying every remaining loose end. The first target was the shell of his professional reputation. I knew Daniel had 2 fallback avenues: the board seats he occupied across several smaller tech startups, and his role as a leadership mentor on a prestigious corporate coaching circuit. It sickened me that even as the scandal spread, these smaller companies hesitated to sever ties. The public statements were tepid, monitoring the situation, awaiting legal outcomes. Corporate cowardice, dressed up as caution. So I applied pressure. First, I organized a coalition of former Drayton employees. We launched a public campaign across LinkedIn, Medium, and industry forums. No slander, just truth. Personal accounts, professional statements. We made damn sure every investor, Every board member, every partner in those startups saw exactly who Daniel was. The response was slow, then seismic. Board after board buckled. One startup founder reached out directly. "Thank you for speaking up. We had no idea the extent of this. We've terminated Daniel's advisory role effective immediately." By the end of the month, he was stripped of every board seat, his name scrubbed from every leadership roster. Next came the coaching circuit. I reached out quietly to women's leadership organizations, corporate diversity councils, any group that valued the integrity of mentorship. I provided them with vetted documentation from our investigation. The response was overwhelming. Petitions launched. Sponsors withdrew. The circuit itself issued a public apology and permanently banned Daniel from participating in any future programs. His career wasn't just damaged, it was scorched. But there was one more layer. Daniel's wife, Marissa, she was no fool. The divorce filing had been swift, public, and strategic. But through Vanessa, I'd learned that she hadn't yet uncovered the full financial picture. Daniel was a man of appearances. He'd hidden assets, funneled funds through shell accounts. Vanessa had seen the emails he'd bragged about at once, late at night, not realizing she was recording. I debated whether to get involved. Then I imagined Marissa, blindsided, left without the resources to rebuild while the man who'd ruined so many lives kept his ill-gotten fortune. That wasn't justice. I reached out through a trusted intermediary, carefully, respectfully. 2 days later, Marissa's legal team contacted me. We met in a quiet downtown office. The lawyers were sharp, skeptical. I provided the documentation I had meticulously organized, cross-referenced, irrefutable. Their faces shifted as they read. This changes everything," one said quietly. I left that room knowing the next phase of Daniel's life would be lived under the suffocating scrutiny of forensic accountants and aggressive litigation. It wasn't about helping Marissa, not entirely. It was about ensuring Daniel couldn't buy a new life out of the ashes. And still I wasn't done. There was one final matter, one that had gnawed at me in quiet hours: the internal enablers. Daniel hadn't acted alone. The VP of her, Stephen Miles, had buried complaints. The legal counsel, Rebecca Shaw, had drafted the non-disparagement clauses to silence victims. They would not walk away clean. I began compiling a secondary dossier, sourcing statements from former employees, documented instances of Stephen pressuring staff to withdraw complaints, emails showing Rebecca advising against external investigations. Once complete, I delivered it anonymously and through legal counsel to the board of directors at Drayton Consulting. The board was already in chaos. Investor confidence had plummeted. High-profile clients had severed contracts. They needed a public bloodletting to staunch the bleeding. 2 weeks later, both Stephen Miles and Rebecca Shaw resigned under intense internal review. The announcement was curt. The message was clear. I watched the news break with a numb satisfaction. It was over, or so I thought. That's when the messages started. Late-night calls from unknown numbers. Anonymous emails, some threatening, some pleading. I wasn't naive. Daniel still had loyalists. People who blamed me for the firm's implosion, for their lost bonuses, for the stain on their resumes. One email stood out. Simple, chilling. "You've made your point. Stop, or there will be consequences." I sat in my darkened apartment, reading it over and over, and then I smiled, because here was the thing. I hadn't stopped. Not yet. That same week, Roxanne's publication released a follow-up piece, a deeper dive into systemic failures at Drayton. My name wasn't in it by choice, but my fingerprints were all over the investigation. I wanted the message clear. This wasn't about one man. It was about the system that had protected him, and if they thought veiled threats would silence me, they had learned nothing. I increased my precautions. Encrypted communications, legal advisories, a discreet security consultation. I wasn't reckless, but I wasn't afraid either, because the final phase of my plan wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about prevention. I spent the next 3 months consulting with advocacy groups, helping draft new corporate harassment policies, speaking off record at leadership summits, ensuring the lessons of Daniel Carver's fall were written into the DNA of as many organizations as possible. And through it all, I kept tabs on him: bankruptcy proceedings, court dates, his name blacklisted across major firms, a shell of a man haunting the edges of LinkedIn under false profiles. The last report I received chilled me, not from fear, but from grim satisfaction. a grainy photo, snapped by a contact in another state. Daniel, disheveled, exiting a cheap motel, alone, freedom gone, family gone, fortune gone. I closed the file. Months later, sitting by the window of my new apartment, light streaming through freshly cleaned glass, I allowed myself a moment of stillness, not peace, not forgiveness, but a clean breath, free of the weight I had carried for so long. I didn't rebuild my career immediately. Some things take time. But when I did, I chose a firm where ethics weren't a slogan, where leadership meant integrity, not predation. Sometimes in quiet moments, I wonder if Daniel thinks of me, if he lies awake in some motel room, tracing the ruins of his empire, and if he does good, because I will never be that woman in the elevator again. Not for him, not for anyone. Months passed. The outside world seemed to have moved on. Daniel Carver's name drifted to the second and third pages of search results, buried under newer scandals. The firm had restructured. Leadership turnover swept through trade and consulting like a storm, leaving only a few familiar names clinging to the wreckage. But I wasn't ready to move on. I wasn't obsessed, exactly. I wasn't spiraling in some bitter vendetta. I was methodical, focused. Because beneath the public shame and professional exile, I knew Daniel still had one asset left: his network. Powerful men don't vanish. They regroup. They find friends in dark places. And Daniel's black book of contacts was deep, cultivated over years of expensive dinners and whispered favors. If I left that untouched, he would rebuild. So I went hunting not for Daniel this time, but for the roots of his influence. It began with Mason Hartman, a name that kept appearing in old financial records and conference guest lists. Daniel's closest confidant, a venture capitalist with a notorious reputation, though none of it had stuck publicly. Mason had kept his hands clean during Daniel's fall to clean. Through back channels, I learned Mason had been quietly floating Daniel's legal fees, covering costs through an intermediary shell company. That was my opening. I traced the shell company through 3 jurisdictions before pinning it to a trust fund controlled by Mason's private firm. The paper trail wasn't illegal yet, but it showed complicity. It showed intent. I packaged the findings carefully, passed them to a financial journalist I trusted, someone who'd covered corporate corruption for years. The article hit a week later. Power broker linked to disgraced executives' legal war chest. It wasn't the lead story of the day, but it didn't need to be. It circulated fast through private Slack groups, industry discords, encrypted channels where reputation mattered most. Investors pulled out of Mason's fund. 2 pending deals collapsed. One by one, the safety nets Daniel relied upon began to tear. But something deeper happened, too, something I hadn't fully anticipated. Women began reaching out, not just from Drayton, from firms across the industry, from Mason's ventures, from adjacent consulting networks. Whispers became statements. Quiet meetings became organized strategy sessions. It wasn't about me anymore. The fight had spread. I attended the first of these meetings in a rented co-working space, a nondescript building near the riverfront. 27 women sat in a circle: executives, managers, assistants, survivors. No cameras, no press, just stories. Some spoke in trembling voices, some with steely rage. All of them carried wounds familiar to me, and all of them asked the same question: what now? That night, a plan began to take shape, not a revenge plot, but a reckoning, a coordinated push to expose systemic rot wherever it festered. I left the meeting with a list of names, not for personal vengeance, for justice. But justice, I learned, isn't always linear. 2 weeks later, I received a hand-delivered envelope at my apartment. No return address. Inside, a single printed photo. Me, walking alone late at night. The timestamp just 3 days prior. No note, no signature. A chill rippled through me. This wasn't about intimidation anymore. It was surveillance. I activated every contingency, notified legal counsel, moved temporarily to a different location, increased digital hygiene, and then I set a trap. Through a contact in cybersecurity, I embedded a traceable signal into my communications, baited messages suggesting a potential weakness, a document I needed to secure. It took less than a week. An unauthorized access attempt pinged back through a server linked, once again, to Mason Hartman's firm. I had my proof. This time, I went straight to federal authorities. Through my lawyers, we filed a formal complaint, presenting the forensic trail in meticulous detail. Subpoenas followed, quietly at first, then publicly. Mason's empire began to crack not from a media story, but from an impending federal investigation. Daniel's lifeline snapped, and as news of the investigation spread, something else shifted. For the first time since this began, I saw fear. In their ranks, several former allies reached out through intermediaries, seeking immunity deals. Internal documents surfaced, emails, memos, financial transfers. The noose tightened, and through it all, Daniel remained silent. No public statement, no interviews, just a man shrinking in the shadows of the monster he had built. But one loose thread remained. Stephen Miles, the former HR VP, had quietly relocated, taking a high-level role at a boutique consulting firm specializing in culture transformation. The irony made me sick. So I exposed him too. Through the same coalition of women, through carefully documented evidence, we built a case. We contacted his new firm's board anonymously at first, then through legal representatives. The board acted swiftly. Stephen was terminated within days. A public apology followed, one that named no names, but everyone in the industry knew. By then, Daniel had all but vanished. But I wasn't finished, because one piece of his empire remained, an offshore trust intended for future ventures. A trust linked to assets Daniel had hidden long before his fall. I spent months tracing it, worked with forensic accountants, international legal experts. It became an obsession, and when we finally cracked it, when we linked the trust to proceeds from illicit deals and proven retaliation payouts, the final blow came. The trust was frozen. The assets seized under pending litigation. Daniel Carver was bankrupt in every sense. Freedom? Gone. Family? Estranged, distanced, legally scorched. Fortune? Eviscerated. His name now synonymous with predation and downfall. A cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms and HR seminars. I remember the day the final court ruling came down. I was sitting in a sunlit cafe. No dramatics, no grand finale, just a quiet message from my lawyer. It's done. I closed my laptop, took a deep breath, and for the first time in over a year, I felt something close to peace. Not forgiveness, never that, but closure. Sometimes I wonder where Daniel is now. A man stripped of power, fortune, and the illusion of invulnerability. Perhaps staring into the same abyss he once forced others to confront. And if he ever tries to crawl back, if he ever thinks the world has forgotten, he'll find me waiting, because some debts aren't erased, they're paid in full. The thing no one tells you about winning is how empty it can feel. You imagine a grand finale, a rush of adrenaline, some neat cinematic moment where everything clicks and you finally feel whole again. But when my lawyer texted me it's done, I didn't feel any of that. Just a strange, quiet stillness, like standing in the eye of a long, violent storm. The man who had ruined my career, tried to ruin my life, now had nothing. Daniel Carver's assets were frozen. His legal battles far from over. His family had cut ties publicly, bitterly. His wife had successfully claimed the remainder of his accessible estate. His friends had abandoned him. His name was synonymous with disgrace across the industry. And yet, the day after the ruling, I still woke up early, made coffee out of habit, sat by the window, watching the world move on as though nothing extraordinary had happened. It wasn't peace. Not yet. Because I knew what Daniel was capable of. Men like him didn't just disappear. They mutated, rebranded, found new circles of influence where past sins were whispered about but not disqualifying. And the coalition of women I'd helped organize, my coalition now, they called it, understood that too. In the months following the trust seizure, we stayed connected. Weekly calls, encrypted chats, private Slack channels. We watched, we listened. And it was through this network that the next thread emerged. Daniel had resurfaced, not under his own name, he wasn't that foolish, but through an old contact from his days in management consulting, a man named Clay Bishop. Clay had quietly incorporated a new leadership development firm in a neighboring state, a boutique operation, just big enough to fly under the radar. And on the firm's internal documents obtained through one of our sources, there it was, Strategic Advisor, DC. Not his full name, just initials. But paired with other internal emails we obtained, there was no doubt Daniel was attempting a comeback. I felt my hands clench as I read the report. It was audacious, almost laughable. Less than a year after being stripped of everything, He was already trying to worm his way back into corporate leadership circles. I called an emergency meeting of our core group that night. 24 faces on the screen, each woman scarred in her own way by Daniel or men like him. I briefed them on the findings, laid out the risks, and then I said the words I hadn't expected to say. We finish this. We make sure there's no second act. No one objected. We planned meticulously. First, we gathered evidence. A complete profile of Clay's firm, its clients, its funding sources. Internal comes proving Daniel's role. Then, we prepared a two-pronged strike, legal and public. On the legal front, I worked with our lawyers to file an injunction based on Daniel's outstanding civil liabilities and bankruptcy restrictions, which prohibited him from acting in an advisory capacity tied to corporate assets. Simultaneously, our media allies began preparing a follow-up expose, not just about Daniel's latest attempt, but about the broader pattern of disgraced executives quietly re-entering the corporate world under false pretenses. The goal wasn't just to stop Daniel, it was to set a precedent. The timing had to be perfect. 2 weeks before Clay's firm was scheduled to headline a major leadership summit where Daniel was slated to appear under a pseudonym, we went live. The injunction hit first. Clay's legal team scrambled, caught off guard. They issued a panicked internal memo advising Daniel to sever all ties immediately. But it was too late. The media story dropped the next day. Disgraced executive attempts come back through shadow firm named names, included documents, quoted industry experts on the dangers of corporate recidivism. Within hours, the summit rescinded Clay's firm's invitation. Clients fled. The firm dissolved within a week, and Daniel, publicly humiliated again. No longer just a disgraced executive, but a repeat offender in the court of public opinion. I remember watching the story spread across Twitter, LinkedIn, news sites. One headline stuck with me: the fall of Daniel Carver, how a predator's empire was dismantled by his victims. Victims. I stared at that word for a long time. It wasn't inaccurate. We had all suffered, but victim wasn't who I was anymore. Not who we were. We were warriors, survivors, architects of justice. And yet, even after the second fall, I remained cautious, because I knew Daniel's playbook. The arrogance, the entitlement. He would try again, but now, he'd find the landscape hostile. By this point, our coalition had grown into something formidable. We had advisors in legal circles, allies in journalism, partnerships with advocacy groups. Daniel wasn't just fighting me anymore. He was fighting an entire ecosystem built to expose and dismantle predators like him. And then came the final blow, one I hadn't even orchestrated. Federal investigators, emboldened by the paper trail we'd built, began pursuing criminal charges tied to Daniel's financial misconduct and retaliatory surveillance. The announcement came quietly, in a press release late one Friday afternoon. Federal indictment filed against former executive Daniel Carver on multiple counts of wire fraud, obstruction of justice, and witness tampering. I read the release 3 times, hardly believing it. They had him, not just in civil court, not just in the court of public opinion, but in the criminal justice system, facing potential prison time. I didn't cry. I didn't cheer. I sat very still, absorbing the weight of it. He had destroyed my career. I had destroyed his life. It was enough. The weeks that followed were surreal. I testified once again, this time for a grand jury, provided additional evidence through my legal team, met quietly with other witnesses, helping them prepare. The machine was in motion now, beyond me, beyond our coalition, and as the months passed, I began to reclaim my own life. I took a new role with a consulting firm that valued integrity. No politics, no predators, just meaningful work with good people. I mentored younger women entering the industry, shared my story when appropriate, not to inspire fear but resilience. And slowly, the rage that had fueled me for so long began to fade, not into forgiveness, never that, but into resolve. A steel thread woven through the fabric of who I had become. One evening, nearly a year after the indictment, I stood on my apartment balcony, watching the city lights shimmer against the dark. My phone buzzed, a message from our lawyer. Verdict in. Guilty on all counts. I exhaled. Long, slow. Daniel Carver would serve a sentence. His freedom gone, his future shattered, permanent consequences, as he deserved. I sipped my wine, watched the lights, and whispered, to no one in particular, good night, Daniel, may you rot in peace. Then I turned off my phone, stepped back inside, and began writing the next chapter of my life. Life after victory is strange, not because things immediately become brighter, more because they become quieter. The relentless noise in your head, the adrenaline, the obsession, it starts to ebb. I thought I would feel hollow when that happened, but I didn't. I felt free. For the first time in over 2 years, I began living days that weren't shaped around Daniel Carver. His prison sentence, 6 years, with no eligibility for early release, had been reported in every major outlet. I had not attended the sentencing hearing. I debated it, long and hard, but in the end, I wanted no part of the performance he would surely attempt. No last look exchanged, no sick satisfaction for him in seeing my reaction. I had already seen what mattered: the headlines, the reactions, the corporate circles, where his name had become a warning, the university that had stripped him of his honorary degree, the former peers who now publicly disavowed him. He would never crawl back from this. The coalition remained strong, more than strong. In fact, we had formalized into an advocacy group now recognized across the industry. We called it the Helena Network. I didn't vote for the name, but I understood why they chose it. We met monthly, reviewed cases, supported survivors. It wasn't about Daniel anymore. It was about making sure no one like him could rise unchecked again. And as for me, I took time, not weeks, months. I traveled, saw old friends I had neglected in the fury of my campaign, hiked a portion of the Appalachian Trail, ate alone in strange cities, learning how to breathe without purpose, how to simply exist again. I returned home different, not healed. I will never be that knave. Some scars are permanent, but stronger, hardened where it mattered, open where it counted. And eventually, I returned to work, not in a towering glass box this time, but with a boutique consultancy founded on real ethics, led by women and men who had seen what unchecked power could do and built an entirely different model. I was welcomed with open arms, not as a victim, but as a force, and sometimes, often, really young women sought me out, not because they wanted to hear the gory details, but because they wanted to know it was possible to fight back and win. I told them the truth. It's hard. You'll doubt yourself. You'll lose things. But if you keep going, if you build the right alliances, you can tear the worst of them down. And they listened, eyes wide, sometimes tearful, always stronger by the end of the conversation. That was worth more than any headline. Months turned into a year. Then, too, Daniel faded into the background of my life. Occasionally a headline would surface, another lawsuit filed against him, new details emerging about his misdeeds. I read them with detached interest. His sentence held, his appeals failed, his family moved on without him. I never reached out to Marissa after it was over. I respected her space, but through mutual contacts, I heard she was rebuilding well, living openly, financially secure, her children protected. That mattered. One day, nearly 3 years after my first step on this path, I found myself in that same Riverside cafe where I had first met Vanessa and received the flash drive that started it all, the same table, the same light through the window. But this time, I wasn't alone. A young woman from my firm, a brilliant strategist, fresh into her career, had asked to meet. She leaned forward across the table. Helena, if they ever come for me, will you help? I smiled, not bitterly, not with rage, with earned, unwavering certainty. I will burn the world down for you if I have to, I said, and I meant it, because I had learned the most important truth of all: predators thrive in silence, but when women stand together, when we speak, when we fight not as isolated voices, but as a chorus, they cannot withstand the storm. Daniel Carver had learned that the hard way, and if others thought they could follow his path, I was ready. We were ready. Always. 1 month after Daniel's sentencing, Drayden Consulting shuttered its original headquarters. The firm attempted a full rebrand under new leadership, but the stain remained. Major clients never returned. Daniel remained incarcerated, appeals exhausted, reputation obliterated. His family severed all public ties. And me? I built something far greater than a career. I built a network. I built a future. And I never walked alone again.